Today we continue to recognise World Day Against Child Labour, and our next conversation is the possible impact on children and the importance of upholding the laws. Joining us in studio is Dr. Ann Barratt, Head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies. Good morning, Dr. Barratt, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us on the show today, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day, because one can only imagine how busy you are.
Very.
Let's get straight into the conversation. Sometimes there can be some ambiguity when it comes to child labour and the detail of it. So what exactly is child labour?
Well, child labour is any work, productive work, that impinges upon or ends or curtails or disrupts the freedom, the potential, the dignity of a child.
Right.
It's really, one might imagine it as a developmental stop. And so as a child works, it's work to have experience, work to understand responsibilities different. Work to gain a little small change during the holidays is different from laboring continuously, which prevents you from having that freedom, that access to education and your developmental goals.
Okay. So let's expound on that a bit more, because again, with the ambiguity, speaking about, you know, making some extra change during the holidays, but impacting education and the rights of the child. So we were talking offset, and you said there are actually about 14 different types.
Yes, let me turn to my notes
Of course.
in true nerd style. You know, as I was looking up to remind myself about this topic, I said, we are very familiar with human trafficking, domestic labor, and maybe agricultural labor, but child labor is extensive. Notable forms globally that we're recognizing that have emerged as more intensified by the pandemic, by climate change. We have, of course, all forms of slavery. And this slavery could be domestic, it could be sexual, it could be others. We have trafficking is a form of child labor, and this is the extreme end of the spectrum. We have forced recruitment and armed conflict, and this is not just about wars. This could be in relation to gangs and gang behavior. That's also a form of labor, whether or not that child is serving as someone with arms or, you know, cooking, carrying stuff, you know, lookouts, that's a form of labor. Prostitution and pornography, as we know, we have a challenge. Drug production and trafficking of drugs happens across the region. Debt bondage, so you owe someone something, and so you send your child. In our culture, let's say you have some, you're a poor relation, or you need some support for your family, and you say, okay, I'll send my son or my daughter to help your family, and that is a form of child labor. It's a cultural norm, not only in our own society. Hazardous work conditions that can cause injury. So, for example, you are doing some work on your household, and you said, well, the children, the boy, the girl will be subject to different kinds of work because they can't resist. They can't say no. Agricultural labor. Whether they're selling, sometimes we see in our own society children selling on the highways, whether they're working in the fields, whether they are packaging and processing, child labor that occurs in our societies. We don't really have mining so much in Trinidad and Tobago, but in other parts of the Caribbean, it's quite prevalent, in Guyana, in Jamaica, and other spaces. Factory work. And sometimes this is invisible labor because they do menial tasks in the factory that is not necessarily recognized and visible. Of course, the ILO has recognized. And the most invisible of all is domestic work and sexual labor. So within the homes, children are then subject to all of these hidden tasks, which contributes to productive families, contributes to things, but curtails their capacity for education, for being a child, which is a human right, and their dignity.
So some really heavy details there. One of the things that we were also discussing and was briefly mentioned is COVID-19. And we know that strides have been made to reduce child labour, but there was, let's say, a slight increase after COVID-19. Why would you say that was?
The big umbrella is poverty, or increasing the conditions that cause poverty. So, for example, if we looked at some of the causes, you will see at the top of the list poverty, but you also have unhealthy family life and insecurities. These insecurities could be health insecurities. These insecurities could be access, education, climate, etc. When COVID-19 hit us suddenly and harshly, and we're still recovering from it, and we're still in it, but, you know, we're not dying, people found themselves losing income, losing structures of support within and beyond the family, our social protections were strained. So then children were brought in to mitigate those losses. There's also lack of access to quality education. Sometimes people can't afford, sometimes people are not sent, sometimes children they can go, but they're underperforming and not getting the attention they need. So when we say lack of access, because we have universal access, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not located in the space. It means that you're not engaged in a supportive learning environment for a range of reasons. You also have conflicts and mass migration, which we know we are contending with. Our conflicts are not war, but our conflicts are state of non-peace within our society. Limited economic resources takes us back to poverty. We have, and I want to really flag this one, and if we can talk about it more, limited understanding of child labor and its social rootedness. And as it says here, and I'm quoting, cultural beliefs and social norms that view work as character building and may contribute to families not fully understanding the dangers of child labor.
So, Dr. Barratt, let's talk about that, because it is something that we do see prevalence, I'm sure, not just here in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the world.
Yes. So we know, I mean, I would have been growing up, you might have been growing up, generations to come say, okay, you need to get experience to get a job. Let's get you a summer job. Let's get you a little something, a little end somewhere. You may have a business and you bring your children into it to support you in your business. You may engage in chores. These are developmental as long as it does not impinge upon your capacity to study, to do work, to have recreation, to relax, to engage in all of those developmental discoveries. When it crosses that boundary where you are preoccupied, where you're almost work and study, or in fact there are statistics for Trinidad and Tobago that examine how children are involved in labor, either complete or mixing with their education and other pursuits, where they can no longer engage in extracurricular activities, where they're missing sleep and missing school and social engagements, and they're experiencing psychological as well as physical effects. Then is when it's no longer developmental. The work doesn't make you strong. The work now impinges upon your dignity and your development. But we say, I did it, so you can do it, and look where I am at now. And so we need to start to rethink how we see our young people as valuable. They're whole human beings. They're not just a body to be used and accessed. And as we engage them in work for developmental purposes, we put those limits. We say, you will work for a period of time to learn, but beyond that learning experience, we then give you chance to play, to enjoy, to study. And I think that's something that we continue to grapple with culturally, not only in Trinidad and Tobago. And that is the site through which we can start to reduce child labor in our society.
This is quite interesting because the conversation comes up of those who have family businesses and children working for the family business. So from what you've just said, we could perhaps look at something like maybe they work on a weekend but not during the week, so it doesn't impede from like schooling and that sort of thing. What would you say are some of the sectors that you most see child labor in?
Well, of course, it will vary across territories, but we definitely have within the sexual labor, sexual exploitation. You know, the Break the Silence Project, which is part of the IGDS at the UE, has been around since 2008, trying to reduce cases of child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation, both starting with offline and now online. And through that work, we see how sex trafficking, prostitution and pornography continues to be a problem and needs to be confronted. That's one that is hidden. It simmers as part of our everyday, but it is still viewed as extraordinary and not talked about. The second one, of course, would be in domestic labor, across families, between families, within neighborhoods, within the yard, that kind of thing. Then we also do have agricultural labor, and within context where families are really pressed for extra hands and extra bodies, whether it's to sale, package, or sew, or support. We have those popular and others, but I'm only speaking from my frame of reference. Others who work on it every day can tell you more. I do think we do have some, we are not like in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia and others, where we have factory work being so profound, but I do think that children find themselves implicated within our commercial entities, but not to the extent as other places. But the three big ones that I can cite for our space is sexual exploitation, domestic labor, domestic slavery, and agricultural labor.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, there's no doubt that there is an effect on children when it comes to being subject to child labor. Let's go through the short-term and then the long-term effects the child will experience.
All right. I would want to categorize them at three levels. The physical effects, which will be more of the short and long, the mental health, and then the societal effects. So in terms of physical effects, depending on the type of work, exposure to disease, exposure to food insecurity, i.e. malnutrition, not having access to considered the range of nutrients that they should have because they are exploited and marginalized, depending on context, especially migrant children. We also have sleep deprivation. We have exposure to harmful conditions and chemicals, depending on if it is agriculture, depending on if it is housework, depending on where it is. We also have physical abuse and, of course, sexual abuse. These are all physical effects, just as a snapshot. But then we have the mental health effects, which are not only short-term, but definitely in the longer term. And I will just outline them so we understand how important it is. We have within our societies, let me just step back a little bit, within our adults, increase in mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. This is a fact of our society. And this starts very early. One cause would be child labor. Children engage in the labor force endure the stresses of adult responsibilities, right? They have to make the money, they have to budget, they have to provide, they have to answer questions. They're subject to threat and violence. And so they have an increased level of anxiety, depression, and so forth. Hazardous work conditions can create, again, anxiety disorders, psychological consequences, stress, chronic stress, lifestyle diseases as they try to mitigate and ease those stresses, coping mechanisms such as, alcoholism, drug abuse, and so forth, especially those in sexual labor. That, of course, has another range of effects and serious mental health beyond what I have mentioned. We also have, of course, pre-existing conditions being exacerbated. They could be genetic, they could be environmental, that may run within families, be it bipolar or schizophrenia or others. And because those are taboo in our society, they remain untreated. Well, you see why that child must continue to work hard labor, because they are no use to themselves otherwise. That's the cultural belief. And then we have the emotional and relational oddities. One is not able to maintain because of low self-esteem. One has a struggle to connect with others. One has a struggle operating in social settings. These are long-lasting. But it's not just about the child alone. We are a community, which is what we always push at UWI and at the IGDS. We create cycles of poverty. Because we say that now we are attending to the practical needs of the immediate, but because this child does not go through those developmental stages, they can then in turn invest in their own development and that of their family and their community, because there's no investment. And I know I'm saying a lot, but it's quite complex. They also cannot pursue future opportunities. Some do grow out of it and start to pursue it as they get older and they get more agency and more liquidity and so forth. But many of them are stuck and trapped in this cycle of poverty, them and their families. There is entrance to social development. The workforce then is presented with limited skills and education, hindering a nation's overall development. So it is an investment in us. Yeah. Let's follow the laws. The legislative framework is quite broad. I can't speak to it specifically, but it is broad. Let's follow it because it is in our own interests. And then, of course, community well-being. Community well-being. When we ignore child labor, we see it happen. Miss, that's not my business. That's not my child. I'm not saying nothing. Let me don't say nothing here. Me know what they're up to, right? That's us. We jeopardize the well-being of our communities as these children are not just the future, but integral members of the society in the present. It weakens community bonds and resilience, and a significant portion of the population face physical, mental, and socioeconomic challenges.
You know, Dr. Barratt, you definitely went into some fantastic detail there when it comes to child labour. And one thing that really just clicked in my mind is speaking about the long-term effects and, of course, mental health. Would you say that in today's society, looking at perhaps, let's say, the older generations, that we see some of these effects on them?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, I work with the adult population as I'm a teacher in the university, and I'm afraid that the prevalence of mental health challenges that are confronted is persistent over the years, and I dare say increased. And these are, one might say, well, when I say privilege, I mean they have access, they are at the top of their scale. So this is talking about those who have opportunity. But if we go to those who are subject to these issues of child labor with more ill effects, their mental health challenges unfortunately remain untreated. It leads to aggression and violence. It leads to unhealthy coping mechanisms, which then affects our state of peace in society. We are seeing an increase. We are trying to destigmatize mental health disorders so that people will seek treatment, but our cultural binds are so strong. And so as we celebrate for another year today, I hope that we can remind ourselves how important it is to serve our interests by confronting our taboos and our presumptions about child labor and then about its effects, mental health, societal, and physical.
This is something that's so important, and you know, something specifically as we're speaking about the older generation and the effects is the fact that many times people may look back and not necessarily realize because they're not ready to come to terms with that. So active steps to take towards being able to recognize what you may have experienced and why it's adversely affecting you today.
Yes.
Now, let's get into how we can stop child labor.
We can stop by acting as a community, but I have a list which I'll share. But before I say anything, I think that there's been work done in our society, thankfully, from state agencies, from the ministries, to the ILO, to civil society groups, to corporate partners, to work to build capacity to address. There's been public education that's happening. There have been campaigns that have been taking place on mainstream media, on your own station that really demonstrates the ill effects and why we should stop it. We need to continue to contribute to this education, whether we do it within community or we partner with those who are already working to reduce child labor, but not only reduce the occurrence, but to address the core contributing factors, improve access to education, improve how much education that person can get. So some of this, of course, will be structural, but some of it can be community, building awareness. What we're doing today, this is what it is, This is what you're taking for granted, the norms that shape the stories we tell ourselves. We then need to also pay adults a living wage. Pay adults a living wage so that they do not feel compelled, because it's easy for me to sit here and say to you, oh, let's don't do this. But if you're starving, you're like, well, at the end of the day, we've got to be practical. If you're doing a job and you get paid a living wage, a wage that allows you to at least feed yourself and your family, then children are more protected. Social protections from the state can mitigate and subsidize, but we need to have a structure where we see that as a necessity. And I want to just reinforce that because it's so important. Of course, government and civil society involvement, which I've already mentioned and which is underway, and discourage the employment of children. Say no. Say no.
Simple.
Yeah. No. How old is this child? 16? The legal age is 16 in Trinidad and Tobago. Is this child 16? And what is this 16-year-old doing? Should this person wait until 18? To what extent? Even in your own business, and you want to incorporate your child in your business, because, they have to learn your business. All right, you shall do 2 hours a day or 3 hours on the weekend or whatever is practical. It's not that you sit down there cash registering for, 17, 18 hours. Financial support, which can happen at the community level, at the state level, at the civil society level, and sponsorship. Those things work together. You go and you... Now, of course, that will always be a tenuous thing because it means choosing in limited resources forces you to choose, but the more we can protect, the better, rather than zero. And then, of course, we must then engage in ethical investments, looking within, self-reflexivity, taking us back to that core point I said, which is most important. In our society, we think strength comes through struggle. It has been theorized, we have this idea of it getting through. You could be a GT boss if you're a nice fella, or you could get through if you're a hardworking person, a strong woman, a strong man. We have this, you have faith. But essentially, we need to revisit what that means so that we do not create trauma for young people.
Wonderfully said. Thank you so much, Dr. Ann Barratt, for joining us this morning. We appreciate you, and all the best as you continue to do your transformational work.
Thank you very much. I was happy to be here.
It's our pleasure. Dr. Ann Barratt joining us this morning as we focus on World Day Against Child Labour. Stay tuned. There's more coming up on the Now Morning Show that you do not want to miss.